Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa usalli wa usallam ala Sayyid al-Awwaleen wal Akhirin. Nabiyyina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa ashabi ajma'in. Wa ba'd. To my beloved brothers and sisters, to our viewers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Alhamdulillah, Allah has blessed us with another opportunity to share information in this very important month of October, Islamic History Month in Canada. And Islamic History Month has become a very important time for people who are seeking truth, for people who are seeking a new world, a world that includes the opinions and the cultures of people regardless of their religion and regardless of their color. And no doubt, the world that we are living in is very confusing, and many people are polarizing. They are tending to go toward their ethnic group or their religion. But the future, the solution, the way out really is as a human race. We need to look at our situation today with the pandemic and with the recession and the rise of racism, and recognize the importance of being open with each other and honest with each other. And this is why Black History Month was established in February to counter the deletions, omissions, distortions dealing with Black people and African people. Similarly, African Islamic History Month has been developed to deal with omissions, to deal with distortions, and to try to bring history from a more objective position. And somebody might ask the question, why is this necessary? It's necessary because we are living within what could be called a Eurocentric type of thinking process. And that means that what has happened in the 20th, 21st century is that the world, which is becoming smaller and smaller with digital technology and mass communications, has been centered in Europe, centered in America, and not centered in the different parts of the world where the people are living. So therefore, for a long time, we used Greenwich Mean Time, and that's changing now too, as the basis of all times throughout the world. When we speak about civilized countries, it's usually the North is developed and the South is underdeveloped. When we speak about progress, it's usually from the North coming South as opposed to the South going North. And it even reached the point where, and this stretches back to the 16th century, where this Eurocentrism really started to kick in. And that is where Gerhard Mercator made the Mercantile Map that we are using for the most part. And in this map, Africa was distorted. The huge continent of Africa that can fit India and China inside of it and still have room was made to look almost the size of Greenland. And that America and the Americas, North and South, were actually made to seem even larger than Africa itself. But we recognize that this is a distortion. And the Peters projection, which was later on made, is showing the world clearer in the way that it should be, that Africa is a huge continent. But the trick behind this is that if you center the world in Europe, if you look at, for instance, Lebanon or Syria, and you say it's the Middle East, that's middle from where? London. If you say China, Far East, that's far from where? London. So if your mind is centered in London, then you have less respect for yourself and your own culture. You will look at the world from the eyes of somebody else, and it is easy to be manipulated. So what we are doing now is to try to bring more of the reality on the ground. If you're able to travel throughout the world, you can see how strange this Eurocentrism is, because if you're living in China, is it Far East? No, it's the center of the world. So the reality is that truth can be hidden in plain sight. And so we want to take off the veils and begin to get closer to the truth. This month in Islamic History Heritage Month in Canada, we are looking at Black people, African people. We are trying to right the wrongs through the lens of Mecca centrism, meaning that through the lens of Islam. So we are looking now at the contributions of African people. We are trying to take out the distortions of Africa, but also at the same time show the Islamic connection between that. And so by doing this, we are able to have a better understanding of Africa and also a better understanding of Islam and Muslims themselves. So when we look at a dated map, and this goes back to just after the time of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu, you will see that the dark green area on this map is the extent of the spread of Islam in the first 100 years. So you will see that Islam spread right across northern Africa into Spain. You can see how far it has gone. And surprisingly enough, where it's circled there in Africa, in Tunisia, this was called by the Muslims Ifriqiya, because they found it being called Ifrigo, which was a word based on the ancient Berber or Greek, meaning a sunny place. They Arabized the word, and then this was used on maps, and it's the first modern usage of Africa. So in a modern sense, Africa actually comes through Arabic, Ifriqiya. Again, this is knowledge hidden in plain sight that the average person is not aware of. When you look at the spread of Islam, you recognize that Muslims were attacked in the north by the Romans. They responded to the attack. And when they responded to the attack, they opened up Jerusalem, Syria, and these areas, recognized that the Byzantine Roman Empire was very weak and they were oppressing their people. So the armies led by Amr ibn al-As radiallahu anh, entered into Egypt. And when Amr came into Egypt and settled in Fustat, which later became Cairo, a group of people approached him. And these people were later called Berber people, but they called themselves Amazigh. And they are the original inhabitants of the Sahara and North Africa. They are an ancient people. And when you go to the southern parts of Libya, Morocco, and Algeria, you'll see caves. And in these caves, you can actually see the drawings of a tropical rainforest. So the Sahara Desert originally was a tropical rainforest. With the change of climate, then it turned into a major desert. So the Berber people, we'll use this term, the Berber people were actually an African people. And if you go more toward the south of the Sahara, they are darker in complexion. They are brown in the middle and in the north. But right around the Mediterranean coastline and in the Reef Mountains, you'll find some of the Berbers are blonde hair and blue eyes. And that is because the Mediterranean people, the Greeks and the Romans and the Phoenicians, and even from Spain, the Vandals, people called Vandals, were Germanic, blonde hair and blue eyes. They occupied North Africa and mixed with the Berber race. So the Berber people, which is this amalgamation of the ancient inhabitants of the desert, they came to Amr ibn al-As. He sent a delegation to Khalifa Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anh. Umar cried, and he said that the Prophet ﷺ prophesied that people like this would one day enter into Islam. This is a picture of the first masjid in Egypt. That's the masjid of Amr ibn al-As, and it's still there up until today. And so when we look at Africa now and the spread of Islam, you'll see that Muslims went right across the northern parts. And these areas, they took away from the Byzantine Romans, and they established centers of Islam. By 670, Uqba ibn Nafi', who was the great tabi'i and the great leader of the Muslims, he established a place called Qayrawan. Now, when you look at the map, you will see that Qayrawan is inside in the desert. And that is because the Muslims are being attacked by the Romans by the sea. And if you look to the left and north, you see the mountains. There were some rebellious tribes of the Berbers, led by Kahina. And so the perfect place for the capital of Islam was in the desert because Muslims were used to the desert and they could move rapidly and they could escape the attacks. So Qayrawan was developed. We still have today Masjid Uqba ibn Nafi', rahimahullah. It's a beautiful place if you can visit Tunisia today. And it is in this masjid that the Maliki fiqh was actually put together. So this is a very important place. It becomes the Western capital of Islam. And it is in these hallowed grounds, in this masjid, that Sahnun and the great scholars put together Al-Mudawwana al-Kubra of Imam Malik and developed what is now the Maliki school of thought, which of course is one of the great four schools of thought within Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. So Uqba ibn Nafi' rode his horse all the way into the Atlantic. And this region here was dominated by the Muslims. Uqba said, if I knew there was land across you, I'd take the message of Islam to these lands. And Uqba, rahimahullah, he was an initiator. He initiated, but there needed to be a consolidator. There needed to be somebody who could consolidate. And the leaders of Islam at the time were the Umayyad dynasty, and they sent one of their great leaders, Musa bin Nusayr, rahimahullah, to be the leader of Muslims in North Africa. So again, now this is Africa. Many Muslims do not understand this history because we're only taught sections of our Islamic history. This is the western capital of Islam in Qayrawan. Musa bin Nusayr, who was the son of a former Christian who was studying to be a bishop. He became Muslim and he served under Khalid ibn Walid. He was freed and he became a great Muslim leader. So Musa grew up with a strong Islamic education, with a sensitivity to people of other religions. And sure enough, when he ran into the Berber people, and this is some of the Berber people, again, they're lighter skinned than this, they're darker skinned also, but these are the Berber people living there. Musa gave them opportunities and they entered Islam in crowds. And Musa then consolidated this huge area, and he really didn't need much else because this is one of the most fruitful places in the world. And it is here in Algeria and Libya and Morocco that the Roman Empire became great, that the Phoenicians, Carthaginians became great, that much of the Mediterranean actually financed itself in this area because the distance is not really far. Across from Morocco, you'll see on your left, there is Spain. And Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, was known as the Land of Vandals. The Vandals were a Germanic people who were the majority at the time living in Spain, and it became known as Vandalusia and later Andalusia. Then it was Arabicized and it became Al-Andalus. Al-Andalus, that the base people in Al-Andalus were believers in one God. They were Christians who refused to accept the Council of Nicaea. They refused to accept Trinity, stayed with their belief in one God. There was also, dating back to the ancient times of 6th century BC, a group of the Jewish people who were escaping Nebuchadnezzar, who had attacked Jerusalem and captured the Jews. A group of them escaped and went to Vandalusia. They were believers in one God. But the Romans, now wanting to consolidate their strength, the Byzantines, they sent King Roderick, who based himself in Toledo in Spain, and he pressed down on the people. He gave them taxes and terrible taxes, and he tortured the people in order that they would go away from one God and would accept the Trinity. This information was sent down to Musa bin Nusayr. He was still not sure, but a governor named Ilian or Julian in a place called Ceuta, and this is the little tip right near Gibraltar. Ilian had sent his daughter to be educated in Toledo. She was raped by Roderick Ilian, who had accepted the Muslims as his leader. He was still a Christian, and Ceuta area was still a Spanish area, but it was paying the jizya, which is less than zakat. And so he asked for help from his leader, Amir al-Mu'mineen Musa bin Nusayr. And Musa, realizing this injustice that was done to the young lady, wanted to test first to see whether Ilian was sincere. And Ilian went across with boats, attacked, and came back. In 710, then the Muslims went across first. They made a landing, checked it out, came back, and it was in 711 that Musa bin Nusayr sent his great general Tariq ibn Ziyad, rahimahullah. Tariq was a Berber, a Mazigh. He had mastered Arabic. He was a fearless leader. He was a great initiator, similar to Uqba bin Nafi'. And in 711, he landed on a mountain there, which was called Jabal Tariq. And shortly afterwards, he was able to defeat an army of 100,000 Visigoths. It was such an important victory that this mountain, up until now, takes his name. So from Jabal Tariq, it becomes Gibraltar. You see? This is how truth is hidden in plain sight right in front of you. There's two Arabic words, but we say Gibraltar. From there, Tariq, rahimahullah, went north and started opening up cities. And when the people heard that the Muslims were not imposing taxes, they were not forcing people to accept Islam, they opened up the gates of the cities of Spain. Musa then went north and he joined Tariq, and within a short time, they had captured and taken over most of Spain, right up until France and a little section of the north of Spain. And they governed this area, and finally they left and went to Damascus. But for 40 years, this area, what is now Spain and Portugal, was being ruled by Muslims, but their leadership either came from Qayrawan or Damascus. That's where the Umayyads were. You can't rule a country like that without a leader. It's not even a time of mass communications like we have today, but even today, it wouldn't work. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then willed that a major change would happen in history, and he raised up Abdurrahman ibn Muawiyah, the Falcon of Al-Andalus, called Abdurrahman al-Dakhil. And he was the last of the Umayyads who had been attacked by the Abbasids. Remember now, there was a power struggle in the Muslim world. And the Abbasid dynasty then took over rule from the Umayyads. Abdurrahman was the last, and he escaped from the area of Iraq. He went across North Africa and he landed in Spain. Now, during his journey, when he landed in Qayrawan, of course, the capital, they told him, no, you would be a perfect person for this area because his mother was a Mazigh. His mother was Berber and his father was an Umayyad. So, and the people would accept the rule. He was a tireless leader, amazing leader, and he went into Al-Andalus and he established an amazing dynasty there. Without him, the whole of the history would have never been the same. And some of the ulama say, Lola Abdurrahman lan tahal Islam fil Andalus. If it was not for Abdurrahman, Islam would have been finished in Al-Andalus. But alhamdulillah, he established Cordoba as his capital. He purchased the cathedral from the Christians, didn't smash it down and take it. He gave them 100,000 dinars, made it the Jami Mosque of Cordoba, which was one of the largest in the Muslim world at the time. He established industry. He established education. Every child could read and write, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, all together. He did not force the people of the book to accept Islam. He led by example. This is the perfect Islamic rule. Because of this, Islam spread amongst the people rapidly. and an amazing dynasty was established. And he ruled from 755 to 787. And during that time, Cordoba, and just after it, it became the largest city in the world. So you look at his time and then his succeeding predecessors, those who came from his dynasty as well, till the year 1000. Cordoba is the largest city in the world. Now remember, the majority of the Muslims who are there actually came from Africa. They are Amazigh. There was Arab troops who came as well. There were some Persians, few people, but the majority were Africans, either the Amazigh or they were Africans who came out of the region of Senegal. And so Cordoba, and it's an amazing thing, again, truth in plain sight. It had running water. It had lighted streets, 10 kilometers. It had hundreds of libraries. It had public baths. It had over almost 1 million people living in it. And Paris and London could not reach this level for 700 years. Could you imagine this? How history has been distorted? That this is an establishment made by Muslims, and the majority of them were of Africans from the African continent, that had established this amazing beacon of light. As a matter of fact, we could say that the European Renaissance was actually brought to Europe by the Muslims and Islam. This is an amazing achievement. And of significance during this time was the leader Abdurrahman III. Now he was called Abdurrahman al-Nasir li-Dinillah. And Abdurrahman al-Nasir made a major move for this dynasty because his Abdurrahman al-Dakhil, the original Abdurrahman, he was far away from the center of Islam, and the Abbasids had become the nominal rulers of the Muslim world. By this time, by the 10th century, the Abbasids were extremely weak. There was also other dynasties set up. There was an extreme Shiite dynasty set up in North Africa. And so the Ahl Sunnah people of the majority of the Muslims needed a proper Khalifa. And so Abdurrahman declared himself to be Amir al-Mu'mineen. In order to do this, he built a beautiful city, Medina to Zahra. It was one of the wonders of the world at the time. And it's amazing because Abdurrahman, if you think about this, he was the Khalifa for much of the Muslim world. And so when the Europeans wanted to visit the leader of the Muslims in the western side here, they wouldn't go to Baghdad. They would go to Cordoba. So in other words, they didn't go to the east, they went west. It's an amazing concept. They went west to the leader of Islam. And Abdurrahman was able to make amazing achievements. He was able to affect people throughout Europe. The scholars of Europe and other parts of the world would come into Al-Andalus for their education. His rule continued for 50 years till 962. His predecessors took over. They were not as strong. Eventually, another strong leader took over in 976, Muhammad ibn Amir, known as Al-Mansur. And Al-Mansur was very harsh on any attacks that were coming from the non-Muslims, but he was also harsh on his own people. And so when his rule was over, his predecessors were not able to maintain their strength, and so division came in. And it was broken down into at least 22 sections. And so the dunya, there was so much wealth there in Al-Andalus. Also fighting, tribalism, brother fighting brother, the abandonment of the Sunnah, and then division coming in And because of that, the Trinitarian forces started to return from the north. And the Pope declared a crusade, not only on the east, but also on the west. So the crusade then took its strength, and by 1072, Alfonso VI, he invaded. He captured Portugal, he captured Toledo. He even went down as far as Seville is concerned. When he reached Seville, it was a crisis. And a great conference was called at that time in 1086. It had 22 emirs, it had the ulama. They all came together in a type of like Rabatat al-Alam al-Islami, Muslim World League, one of these type of meetings. The emirs, of course, being people, dunya type people, because they had turned on each other. This was part of the weakness of Al-Andalus. Remember the divisions. They said, let's pay bakshish, we'll pay them off, bribe them. But one of the leaders, Al-Mu'tamid Billah, the leader of Seville, he said, no, we should call in Al-Murabitun. And the people said, why should you have Al-Murabitun? Why call these people in? Who are these Murabitun? This is another important point where Africa is influencing Europe and the destiny of Europe. Al-Murabitun, and this is a typical look of a Murabit at the time, they were Berber people, Amazigh, African people, whose leaders had established themselves. The original leaders, Yahya ibn Ibrahim, he found his people, these are the Berbers now in the desert. He found them in a state of weakness. He went to Hajj and then to Qayrawan, and the leader of the Malikiya, Imran al-Fasi, Sheikh Imran al-Fasi, he said, go to a man named Abdullahi ibn Yasin. Now, these are names that you need to know to understand our history in Africa and how it influences Europe and the rest of the world. Abdullah ibn Yasin went to the Amazigh people. He taught them Islam, but they rebelled against him. He went south in the desert to Senegal. And there he set up a community. They called it Ribat. And a Ribat is a tent area. He started with 5 people. He taught them their Islamic studies. He taught them to call to the good and forbid evil. He believed in economic purity, that the wealth should be shared. He went from 5 to 1,000 to 12,000 warriors. He was killed and made shaheed in one of his dawah missions. Eventually, the rule was taken over by a man named Jibril ibn Umar. The sources show him, you can see to the left, he was a black man who was one of the Berber people as well. And he made the capital Marrakesh, which is in the background. This is where the name Morocco comes from, and the famous Qutubiyya Mosque there. It's interesting because Jibril ibn Umar heard about Islam in the south, in Senegal, and all the way across. So he gave the leadership to Yusuf ibn Tashfin and dedicated his life in the Dawah. Yusuf ibn Tashfin was a great leader. He consolidated the ranks until he had 100,000 horsemen. So this is the reason why the council was a little bit unsure to call in the Murabitun. But you know what Al-Mu'tamid said? He said it's better to be a camel driver than a swine herd. Now, what do you think that means? Think about that for a minute. It's better to be a camel herd driver, in other words, to be underneath Bedouins, Muslims, than to be a swine herd, to be under Christians that will make you take care of their pigs. And so the Murabitun were called in, 1086. They drove back the Crusaders. The rule or the agreement was that they would not stay in Spain. They would return to Africa. And they agreed to the rule. They were good Muslims. They went back. But again, they were called. 1088, please come back, help us. Christians are coming again. They brought their forces again, defeated the Christians, and then they returned south. The weakness of the Andalusians who had become soft in one of the most luxurious lifestyles in the world. In 1090, they called him back again. This time, Yusuf ibn Tashfin told his forces, if they will not help you, if they cannot defend themselves, take everything. And so the Morabitun returned, and then they took over the whole of Spain. So at that time, the Morabitun holdings was most of Spain, North Africa, all the way down into West Africa. And remember Jibril ibn Umar, that he continued the dawah, and he went all the way across into Central Africa. Hundreds and thousands of people embraced Islam, not by the sword, but through interaction and teaching at the hands of Jibril ibn Umar, rahimahullah ta'ala. The Morabitun continued ruling for a period of time. But you know that there is a theory of Ibn Khaldun, and that is that, after 100 years, if a dynasty does not renew itself, the same factors will happen. If they don't watch out, the dunya, wealth, will come in. The Prophet ﷺ said, Inna li kulli umma fitna, wa fitna to ummati al-mal. Every nation has a trial and test. The trial and test of this nation is wealth. Division, fighting brother against brother, until it broke up. This is the cycle of rule, you could say. Not necessarily exactly 100 years. It's a couple generations. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would will another African group was developed. These are known as Al-Muwahidun. And they developed in 1121, Sheikh Muhammad ibn Turmat, who was a great Islamic scholar, a bit extreme. In the Atlas Mountains in Morocco, he developed the group. And with the corruption of the Morabitun, another wave of African Muslims come into Al-Andalus, Al-Muwahidun. And they rule, they reestablish Islam, bring justice and peace back to the land. They develop buildings, education, but the rule kicked in. I'm covering a lot of ground in a short time because of our time. The rule then kicked back inside. There it was again, division, greed, brother fighting brother, and finally it broke up. And Muslims started to lose their territory, even despite Abdul Mu'min ibn Ali. He tried. He was a good leader. He tried his best. But eventually, within that 100 years, Al-Muwahidun then began to get corrupt, and the conquest, the Crusaders started to conquer the territories. And so, within a short time, then, Granada, in the south, you see the green area, this becomes the base of Muslims in the whole of Spain and Portugal. And for 250 years, Granada was their base. There was the state of Granada itself, Granada. There was Malqa, which is known as Malaga today, and Almeria, which is Almeria today. This was protected by mountains in the north and sea in the south, protected by Muslims from Morocco. And it's about 15% of the landmass of Al-Andalus, but all the Muslims who could escape the Crusader conquest, they fled south down into Granada. And but again, after a period of time, abundance of wealth, squabbling, tribalism, leaving the Sunnah, the Trinitarian forces surrounded Granada till it reached the point where it looked like there was no return. Before we reach the end of Islamic rule, some very important points about what was happening as the Crusaders would come down. When they took over a territory controlled by the Muslims, and sometimes it was hundreds of years, literally. Remember, Muslims were in Spain for 781 years. And when they took over a territory, they would first need the Muslims, because all the skills and education and technology was with the Muslims. So they required Muslims to wear special clothes, Even they would put badges on Muslims and put them in ghettos and control them. And they used a general term for the Muslim. They say moros. And that means a dark-skinned person in Latin. So this is where the word Moors comes from. So you will hear people saying the Moors of Spain, Othello. Even Shakespeare wrote about the Black Moor, Othello. And so Moors is not actually a tribe in Africa. This is a misnomer. It was only the Trinitarian European way of describing Muslims, because Muslims were people of color, generally people of color, because the majority had come from the African continent. After a period of time, the Muslims became servants, mudahares, they call them, or mudajjal, which is like an imposter. Okay, so this is a person now who is like two-faced. They're still Muslim, but they have to play this domesticated role of a servant. Eventually, the Inquisition kicked in, and as they start torturing people and forcing them to become the Christians, then those who could not fight back, those who could not make hijrah to the south, to the Muslim lands, they would baptize themselves as a Christian, but they'd keep Islam inside. You could say a Christian Moor. The name was Morescos. The Jewish people who could not hold on to their Judaism, they baptized in the Christian church, and they were called Morenos. Okay, so these were hidden people who were there. By 1483, the Inquisition was in its height, torturing people, burning them at the stake. Many of these techniques that you see today for torture actually were developed there in these Trinitarian Spain. The Ku Klux Klan hoods on your head, the different devices that are being used in torture centers around the world. This is where much of this horrible way of torture was developed. Over 2 million Jews were killed or exiled. Over 3 million Muslims were exterminated, exiled from the lands. Finally, the Muslims became weak. The final leader, Abu Abdullah, called Boabdil, he surrendered Granada, which is the last base of operations for the Muslims, in 1492. Remember this date, not because of Columbus, because he was lost. He bumped into America on his way to India. It was the surrender of Granada. And this is now where African Muslim presence there in Spain in Portugal is now lost. The power is lost. The people were put down, and the final surrender. But the agreement was that Muslims could still keep their masjids, and the women would be safe. The madrasa could continue. All of those treaties were broken. And by 1526, the Catholic Church had another inquisition. The Muslims resisted this terrible torture again. A rebellion broke out in the south. This rebellion was put down by terrible conquistadors, General Mundahares, the scorched earth policy. They would come into the lands of Muslims, come into the lands of even people who said that they were Christians, Morescos, right? And they would torture them, burn everything until they finally put down the rebellion. It is this mentality that the Spanish and the Portuguese carried into America. This is the reason why they would land on the shores. Look at pictures of Columbus, of Balboa, of Pizarro, Cortez. Look at the pictures, and you will see people coming in armor, ready to fight. The native people of the Americas are looking and saying, "What is wrong with you?" and trying to help them. But in their minds, it was called Reconquista, the reconquest. And so they continued this fight against Islam and Muslims. They took it across. And this is important because they even called parts of Spain, of Mexico, in the Yucatan province, it called it El Qahira, Cairo. It is reported that when one of the boats went around the bay in Cuba and they looked up, they said, Mesquita, that this is a mosque on the top of the hill. They were seeing Muslims everywhere. They even went around to the Philippines. This is the Spanish. And when they saw the Philippine Muslims, they said Moros. Remember the word Moors. And Moros is still being used today by the Filipino organizations in Mindanao. And so this is an important lesson for us today. Al-Andalus, 700 years of the rule. It is the clearest example of the rise and fall of civilization. And it shows us, sunnatullah, that when we practice our faith, when we are true to our tawheed, when we don't let color divide us up, when we don't let tribe divide us up, when the rich are paying zakat, Allah gives us authority. It is promised to us. But when we leave our belief in one God and practice forms of shirk, when race and tribe comes into our thinking, when brother fights brother, sister fights sister, one group against another group, treachery goes on, one emir against another, the power and authority is taken away from us like any other nation. This is a great lesson for us, and it is something that we have learned with the spread of Islam coming from Africa, which is a huge continent, and people of color from the desert now coming into Europe, developing with the beauty of Islam, amazing empire, 781 years. By the year 1000, the largest city on earth, the basis of the Renaissance of Europe, the basis of European universities, the basis of the technology of the societies that we are living in. This is the truth which is hidden in plain sight. And Islamic History Month, we are endeavoring to bring the truth about Islam and Muslims to the surface so we can break down tribalism amongst ourselves, racism amongst ourselves, and misunderstanding with people of other faith. So I leave you with these thoughts, and I ask Allah to have mercy on me and you. I leave you with peace. Wa akhir da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.